Hello, hi everyone. I am Jennifer Caddick. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Engagement with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And welcome to our very first episode of our Lakes Chat Summer Series. We'll be coming to you live every Tuesday this summer to chat about all things Great Lakes. And I'm really excited with our guest today, Don Jodrey, who is the Alliance for the Great Lakes Director of Federal Government Relations. And Don is based in Washington, D.C., and he's going to give us the scoop on water infrastructure funding, a super important topic. It seems like infrastructure is in the news just about every day these days. And so he's going to give us an update on the water pieces of that puzzle and what it means for us here in the Great Lakes region. So welcome, Don. Before we get started, I just want to give a shout out to my amazing colleague, Michelle Farley. You don't see her on screen, but she's behind the scenes helping us make all of this magic happen. And she'll drop in the chat, she'll drop some links for resources to read a little bit more about some of the topics that we are going to cover today, and also some opportunities for you to get involved. So big thanks, Michelle, for all your help on this. So Don, let's just dive right in. Good water reference there. It's hot here where I am, so I wish I could go for a swim. I just want to level set a little bit before we talk about all the policy stuff. We use the phrase water infrastructure a lot, but what do we really mean? What's included in that bucket of stuff called water infrastructure?
Well, sure, Jen, and thanks for having me join you today for this broadcast. Water infrastructure, when we talk about it in terms of legislation that we want to see happen in terms of getting additional funding for states and local communities, it's really about the systems for water delivery. And that is systems that treat water, that deliver water, that store water, resource management issues. And this is for water that is needed really for drinking water and wastewater treatment. Water systems in this country also include, canals and hydropower and flood prevention. But we're really talking, when we talk about water infrastructure in Washington, D.C. right now, in terms of these big infrastructure discussions, the president's big plan, we're talking about basically the systems that we have in place to get water to come out of your tap in your house. So that's what we're talking about.
Got it. And I think one of the challenges with this issue is it's kind of invisible, right? We don't think about it. We just assume that when we turn on the tap or flush the toilet, everything's going to work the way it's supposed to work. But we know that there are a lot of really big problems with water infrastructure, particularly in some of our older Great Lakes cities. And there's a pretty big price tag with all of that. I've seen the number that to fix and upgrade our water infrastructure in Great Lakes cities, in all 8 Great Lakes states, the price tag is about $188 billion, which is a lot of money. So what are some of the problems that we need to fix? Where is the system failing and going wrong?
Well, you're exactly right about it being an invisible problem. I mean, most Americans take for granted that they can turn on the tap water and they're going to have clean, safe drinking water, unless, of course, you live in Flint, Michigan, or in one of the communities maybe in somewhere around the country where you've had contamination issues and you suddenly can't drink the water and you have a drinking water advisory and stuff. So yes, it's an invisible problem. And the reason it's invisible is because the infrastructure that's used to deliver and treat the water to get it to your house is decaying. Some of it is in place. It's over 100 years old. We have lead service lines all around the country, and we know that lead in the water is bad. It's very harmful to your health. We have sewer overflows because some of the sewer infrastructure in big cities, they have these combined sewer overflows where when it rains too much, the water doesn't go into the sewer treatment, it goes into the nearby water body like a lake or a stream. So a lot of the water infrastructure is just decaying and it's ending its useful life, and we need to be in a place where we periodically repairing and replacing and upgrading. You mentioned, I think it was a really good point, you mentioned the $188 billion need around the Great Lakes. And people wonder, how did we come up with that number? Well, EPA, under its statutory mandates, goes out and assesses the health of the nation's water infrastructure. And they divide it up into drinking water infrastructure and water that's necessary for water quality treatment. And they have numbers associated with it by states in terms of what the backlog is of needs. And it's a gargantuan amount of funding. And states and local communities are really hard pressed to deal with that because it's so large, right? So that's really what we're talking about here. And we're not mentioning some of the more emerging issues with our infrastructure where it's susceptible to climate change impacts, especially in cities that are near the coast, or we have contaminants in drinking water. PFAS is the thing that's mostly referenced. We've got chemicals that are in our water. We now have microplastics in our water. And a lot of this is just from development, but our drinking water systems are compromised. And I think, you mentioned the need, but the American Society of Civil Engineers, if they're going to give ourselves a grade, would give us a D+. So it's, there's just a lot of latent problems that really need to be fixed. And as you said, it's kind of an invisible problem because it's not something that people focus on or hear about every day.
Yeah, and I think you point out a great point there that we use the phrase all the time, if we don't fix it now, the problem's just going to get worse and more costly. And I think this is, climate change and all of these emerging issues, that's a great example of that. We have a huge problem now, but the longer we wait to fix it, it's going to be even bigger. And so, a lot of that goes to why the Alliance for the Great Lakes earlier this year listed the need for a significant funding increase for water infrastructure as our number 2 ask in our annual list of Great Lakes federal policy priorities. And there's a ton going on in Washington, D.C. on all of this right now. So let's start at sort of the beginning, which is President Biden's big speech. I think he was in Pittsburgh back at the end of March. And he made a giant infrastructure proposal, which included all kinds of stuff. He's proposing more money for fixing our roads and bridges, which is super important, supporting the expansion of broadband internet. Of course, here at the Alliance, we're focused on just the water pieces of that. So tell us a little bit about some of the highlights that President Biden would like to see in his infrastructure proposal.
Right. So we've talked a lot about sort of what's in the Biden administration's proposal on infrastructure, and that is kind of like driving the debate here in Washington on all the different infrastructure components of his plan. But in his plan, which, as you mentioned, covers roads and bridges and also social infrastructure and other things related to human capital, the water component is $111 billion. And I think the Biden administration proposal is notable for 2 things. It proposes to completely replace all lead service lines around the country. It's $45 billion in estimated need. And that's seen as a huge investment in public health in terms of being able to replace lead service lines, because we really don't want to have lead contamination in our drinking water supply. And then the other main component for the water piece is $66 billion, which is divided equally between the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And this is basically how federal funds, or most federal funds, go to support water infrastructure in states and local communities around the country. It's these revolving funds were set up under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. And what they basically do is they provide federal investment in the form of grants and loans, low interest loans, to communities, so that they can, upgrade, repair, and build sort of water service, either for delivery of drinking water or for treatment of water for water quality purposes. And so the Biden plan proposes $66 billion divided up between those 2 funds. And that's kind of what the proposal is. And it's also spread out over an 8-year period. So to give you a context of what this means, current federal appropriations, which go toward these funds, it's appropriated annually by the Congress, total about $3 billion for water infrastructure. The Biden plan, if you were to put it out over an annual basis, would be $20 billion a year. So it's a multiple increase on the order of 6 times current funding. And that's the way I like to think about it when you're thinking about what does it mean in terms of the president's proposal to invest in water infrastructure.
So that sounds like some good news potentially for the Great Lakes, but we know that the president doesn't have the power to do this all by himself. And this is just his sort of opening salvo, his first offer, his proposal. And so he sent that over to Congress, the other end of Washington. And I know the Senate and the House of Representatives their committees are meeting. They've got all of their own proposals and counter proposals. So tell us a little bit about what things look like on Capitol Hill, and if there's any good news there for the Great Lakes.
Well, pardon the pun, things are murky in terms of water infrastructure. And I hate to say that because it's a horrible pun. But, it's The Biden plan is not accepted. And I think we've all been reading that in the papers, either the trade press or the popular press. I mean, there's been a lot of resistance. I think it's on the cost. The overall plan for infrastructure is in the trillions of dollars. And we know that members of Congress are just not willing to go there. So we have seen counter proposals. You know, the president is currently working with a group of senators led by Senator Capito of West Virginia to sort of scale this down. And so I think they're, you know, at about $1 billion or slightly below level in terms of infrastructure talks. So the talks between the White House and Capitol Hill are kind of ongoing, and it's really unclear to me whether or not they're going to be successful in having a big infrastructure bill that would wrap in water infrastructure and transportation and anything related to broadband, which seem to be the topics that people are coalescing around. At the same time that this is happening, we see movement in the Senate and the House on water infrastructure packages. The Senate passed a bill, the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act of 2021, that's $35 billion, and it funds, it quadruples current funding levels. It also provides for additional subsidization of grants so that states don't have to pay so much, and it has a pilot program for low-income water assistance. So the Senate plan is around $35 billion, and on an annualized basis, it's $7 billion a year. So it's slightly double the current rate. The House has not passed any legislation yet. The House is very partisan at the moment, but we see two committees of jurisdiction that govern water infrastructure. We have the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and we have the House Energy and Commerce Committee that are both considering water bills. You know, and basically taken together, they're at about $101 billion. And if you were to annualize that, it's about $14 billion a year. So it's about twice as much effort as the Senate has going, and it covers more things. And so we see them working on that legislation now. The legislation is going through what's called a markup phase. They've had hearings, they've had markups, but they haven't, you know, passed anything. So I guess what I call this period of time, you know, if we were calling it murky, if I were doing it in my law school class, I would call it negotiation and compromise. It's very much a topic of negotiation. What isn't clear is where are they going to compromise and where are they going to find common ground to pass the bill that they can send to the White House and sign. And I think we're going to be in this period for at least, you know, the month of June, the month of July, maybe August, maybe September. I think it's going to go on because this seems to be dominating the conversation. And it's unclear to me with the Democrats, you know, having such a, you know, 50 votes, and we have one senator from West Virginia who doesn't want to end the filibuster or use reconciliation. It's really unclear how it's going to wrap up. But on the plus side, everybody's talking about water as part of infrastructure. So that is a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important, you know, that this is an ongoing process. You know, I think we imagine, you know, the president says something, Congress says check, and we move on. And so this is a really complicated process. There's, I don't know how many members of the House, I should probably know, you know, and 100 senators and so on. So there's a lot of people involved in this conversation with a lot of different, you know, perspectives and needs. You know, I'm going to pause here. If you're just joining us, I'm Jennifer Caddick with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and joining me is Don Jodrey, the Alliance's Director of Federal Government Relations. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here and ask about sort of equity. You know, as we've talked, there's some eye-popping numbers here that cities are saddled with around the Great Lakes to address and fix our water infrastructure. But we know that in many communities, those costs aren't shared equitably. You know, we have rising water and sewer bills as cities try to pay for all of this. That snowballs to a problem with residential water shutoffs because people can't afford their bills, and a whole host of other issues. Is there anything in all of these proposals that tries to address some of these equity issues and environmental justice?
Yeah, there are things in them, and you know that's good news. And you were just mentioning, you know, people that have their water shut off. I mean, it's really inconceivable to me that this happens in this country, right? But we've got data suggesting that 1 in 3 Americans have problems paying their water bills, and particularly during the COVID crisis last year when people were unemployed. I mean, it was even perhaps larger. In fact, the recently enacted legislation that dealt with sort of COVID relief includes money for low-income water assistance to help people pay their water bills. And we also know that these funding issues for local communities and utilities are partially, it's because the federal investment in water infrastructure has declined over the years. Pretty much, I think in the late 70s, we had the federal government paying about 67% of the cost, and now it's about 7%. And so as local rate utilities try to pass those along to consumers, they're reaching an affordability issue. And I think they're really highlighting for Americans that Americans have a problem with affordability of water, which is something that I think is sort of emerging on the scene here as an issue. In terms of how the current legislative efforts deal with this, as I mentioned, the Senate passed bill has a pilot program to help low-income households pay their water bills. And that's a good thing. It kind of picks up off the program that was in the COVID relief bill and sort of establishes that as a pilot, presumably with the goal towards becoming a permanent program. And also the Senate bill directs the EPA to kind of study the issue and make recommendations on how to deal with this. Do we deal with this by passing grants, funds to states that would turn around and give grants to utilities that would then help ratepayers, or do we go directly to the utilities? So the Senate program at least addresses the issue. And the good news about that is, the water bill that passed in the Senate passed by 89-2. So there's a lot of bipartisan support for the issue of water affordability. In the House side, we have a couple of small bills that are targeting the issue. We have the Low Income Water Assistance Bill, H.R. 3293, that sets up a program. Unlike the Senate bill, however, it would give funding, it bypasses the states and EPA and just gives the funding directly to water utilities. So we see action at the legislative level, but we haven't seen anything that would permanently make this program available, which is where I think we need to be going. And I know that the Alliance supports that. You've already highlighted that, but it's a growing concern for many Americans. And it's really, as I said, unconscionable that people would not have access to safe drinking water in their house, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you consider that our cities live on the shores of the world's largest freshwater system, right? It's unconscionable is the right word there. So just quickly here, as we sort of wrap up our conversation, you used the word murky before. I'm all about the water puns. Let's keep it going. I'm hearing some potential optimism. There's some bipartisan support for some of these proposals. I know that voters are interested in this issue. I saw some polling a while ago that 78% of voters polled kind of across the political spectrum support water infrastructure investment. But at the same time, we've got this super divided, contentious atmosphere in Washington. Just really quickly, if you could consult your crystal ball, how do you think this might shake out? What do you think?
Well, I'm hopeful that, I guess, my personal thought on this would be, I think we're going to see a much smaller infrastructure package pass. I think that we're headed towards some kind of compromise. I don't know what the total funding level is going to be, but I have a feeling that we're going to see something smaller from these negotiations that are going on with the administration and the group of senators. That's my guess, just because I think that, some folks are really dug in. And I think there's also benefits to having something like that. That would be a really good first step for infrastructure. We know there are huge needs for transportation, for water, for broadband, for other things. But I don't think we're going to see the president's big proposal, because I don't think that the members of Congress are ready for that. But I do think that there's enough support for water and for roads that we're going to see an increasing federal investment in this area. And that's kind of what I'm hopeful for. When I think about all the good things that are happening, we see the issue is front and center in the House and Senate. We see legislation introduced. We see it passing in the Senate. I think something will pass in the House. So that's all good. So I think we're going to see a smaller infrastructure package. I just don't know when. If we don't get that, I think the next thing we're going to see is smaller individual bills. Mm-hmm. And we might see it that way. We might see it in the form of, there'll be a water infrastructure bill that goes to the president. There'll be a transportation bill that goes to the president. There might be some other bill that addresses some other aspects of the infrastructure discussions, and we might see several small ones. And I think you might ask me, or maybe you're going to ask me, what can people do? Mm-hmm. People feel fairly powerless when these big things are debating. They say, our voice doesn't matter and all that. But I think that's wrong. I think the important thing is that you need to do as a voter and as a concerned citizen is write your representative, your House member, your senators, and weigh in. And also your local politicians, your local representatives, either in the state legislature or the governor, because this is how, members of Congress and also your state legislatures hear from you and react. I mean, they react to citizens who voice complaints. Water is one of those unique issues. It has a constituency that's naturally really large. But I think because the problem is so localized and it's so diffuse, it doesn't tend to get the groundswell of public opinion that some other big issues might have, but it's critically important. So I think the most important thing you can do is write in and express support for these issues, whether it's infrastructure funding or water affordability or dealing with contaminants. I mean, this is how it happens. You gotta make your voices heard.
Absolutely, and you read my mind, Don. We make it really easy for people who want to write, and we would encourage all of you to write your elected officials. We make it easy. I know Michelle has dropped a link in the chat to our infrastructure alert. It takes just a couple minutes for you to write a letter, and as Don has pointed out, this is an ongoing conversation in Washington, so your voice really will make a difference right now. So I hope you'll all take action. And Don, I know we could talk for hours on all of this. It's endlessly fascinating, and I know that you're going to keep an eye on things in Washington and keep us updated by our blog, and hopefully we can have you back on our little Lakes Chat show here. And again, to all of you, thank you for joining us. Huge thanks, Don, for being our first guest on this. Again, Don Jodrey, Alliance for the Great Lakes, Director of Federal Government Relations. Big thanks to my colleague, Michelle Farley, who is helping us out on the back end. As I said, we're going to be here with you every Tuesday live. Join us next week, Tuesday, June 15th at 1 Eastern, noon Central for our next episode, where we'll have Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO, Joel Bremmeyer. We'll be talking with Joel about the Alliance's 50th anniversary, which we celebrated in 2020, and our upcoming Great Blue Benefit. Again, I'm Jennifer Caddick, Vice President of Communications here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.